This lesson is about Om, the meaning of it, the sound of it, the practice of it. When I started doing yoga, I loved most of what happened in the classes. One thing I did not love, though, was the chanting of Om. None of my early teachers could explain what it meant or why we were doing it. To me, it felt culty and confusing. Eventually, that frustration led me to try a different approach. Instead of thinking about the meaning, I decided to just listen to it. And in those first moments of non-critical listening, I started to finally get it. In the sutras, the discussion of Om comes after the discussion of Ishvara. Here are the sutras that we've looked at that discuss Ishvara. He states that accurate discernment is attained through aligning actions with contemplation of the true self. This is Ishvara Pranidhana. Then he defines Ishvara as the distinct true self, not touched by the pain of afflictions, nor by actions, nor by the fruits of accumulated actions. And it's said that therein is the seed of unsurpassed knowledge of all, that Ishvara is the teacher of all teachers and is not affected by time. And then here's where we get into Om. It is expressed, that is, Ishvara's meaning, vocally with the syllable Om. The word for the syllable Om is pranava. Its meaning is realized through repetition. So without having studied the sutras yet, that is how it resolved for me, was instead of trying to learn its meaning from a book or from a teacher, to just do it. So a very important lesson in learning simply by experiencing something. And from that repetition comes inward focus and negation of obstacles to that inward focus. So it's interesting how Om works. It's very interesting how the graphic of the character and the physical process of making the sound does this. It's not magic. It's actually fairly simple when you take it apart. The sound, called pranava in Sanskrit, starts outside with the O sound and ends inside with the M sound, much like yoga practice itself. When making the O sound, there is no palpable boundary between the sound inside the mouth and the sound outside of it. Inside and outside during the O sound seem to mesh, just as yoga philosophy tells us our mind tends to do before we learn to still it. But then as the sound transitions to M, it begins to be felt inside the body with closed lips, clarifying the border between the inside and outside. Then after each repetition, there is silence, which begins inside where the M ended. The process of repeatedly shifting focus from the external to internal eventually shows the practitioner the infinite that lies deep inside, beyond thinking, beyond sound, and even beyond silence. Phonetically, there are 4 parts that make up pranava. The O part of Om is made up of A and U, A and U. However, they combine or monophangize to make the O sound. This pose, called Tanasana, is an example of that monophthongization. The A at the end of Parshva, which means side, combines with the U that begins Uttanasana. Ut means intense. Together they make an O. So this is not Parshva Uttanasana, it's Parshvottanasana. Much like Om is Om, not Aum. Occasionally you may hear people pronounce the A and U, but they are taking things a bit too literally. The component of the final sound is and always has been Om. Pronouncing it as Aum would be like calling this thing a koat. Omkar is the name of the character that represents pranava. It can appear with slight variations depending upon the script that's being used. but its universal, older representation, seen here, is comprised of a set of 3 joined curves, above which hovers a 4th curve and a dot. Each of these 5 elements graphically expresses the path of the yoga practitioner toward the reliable and enduring happiness that can exist within the context of a human life. In terms of representing the sound, pranava, the lower curve represents A, or A. The curve on the right is the U sound. The top left is the M sound. And the dot is the silence after the sound. The 3 lower curves represent 3 stages of the human mind's progression from ignorance and suffering to clarity and happiness. The dot above represents the infinite, true, non-ego self, the source of the happiness. Separating the dot from the lower 3 curves is a horizontal curve, which represents the way that our mind can hide the infinite from us. Let's take a closer look at these 5 elements. This curve, the A sound, represents the moving mind, and it is the biggest one because this is where most of us are almost all of the time. The open shape of the curve and its tapered form indicates that it's hard for us to know when the mind is moving where the permanence of true self ends, that which is inside, and the impermanence of worldly things, that which is outside, begins. In that confusion, we tend to misidentify with possessions or relationships when in fact those things are not really who we are. That misidentification is the source of painful experience and harmful behavior, as we saw articulated in a previous lesson about Sutras 2.3 through 2.5. That these afflictions, the kleshas, come from avidya. It is the origin of all of them. And that ignorance is when we misidentify the impermanent ego construct for the true infinite aspect of self. So at some point, it's likely that the suffering will lead one to try a better way. That quest is what the next curve on the right is about. This curve represents yoga practices, all of which are variations of the same thing, trying to focus on one thing at a time. We draw the mind inward. Practice, we know Patanjali's practice, called abhyasa, is defined by this endeavor. Stilling the mind's muddying ripples clears up our view of the vastness that underlies thought and ego. This curve is almost a closed circle, but there is a little gap which represents one of the main pillars of yoga practice. The practice is not about disappearing from the world. If it were, the circle may be closed. Rather, it's about redefining it while engaging and experiencing it. My teacher used to say, to become truly enlightened, go to the marketplace. Meaning, by being in the world but not letting it get you down, you really learn how to live above it all, yet in it all. It's not an escape. That is why the curve is not quite a closed circle, much like the mouth, which is not quite closed when it finishes up the O sound, before closing to say M. Repeating the practice that this element represents allows you to go back into the world of activity and things and see it differently, which is what the next curve is about. The third top left curve represents the mind as it is after the second curve's restructuring of identity, so that we recognize the true self. The state of clarity and freedom from injurious desires is called vairagya, or non-attachment in Sanskrit. Now the world and its things can be experienced. The circle is open without the suffering that is inevitable when identity is based upon them. The curve is open again, as in the first curve, but this time it does not taper. Here's why that matters. In Sutra 129, it's stated that the repeated recitation of Om is one way to go inside. When Patanjali breaks down his 8-limb organization of yoga practice, this process of going inside is called Pratyahara, withdrawal of the senses from external objects. The 8 limbs can be organized into 2 sets, those that deal with the external, finite, and changeable aspects of experience, called Bahiranga, and those that deal with the internal, pure, and infinite aspects of experience called Antaranga. Pratyahara lies in between. It's the practice of being in the world of activity without letting that activity shift identification away from true self. These are the separate limbs. So this top left curve represents our openness to experience with a blunt border between what is in the curve and what is not. Having gone inside, that's what happened in the curve on the right. Now there is a clear line between what is inner, formless self and finite, changing, external, and manifest non-self. The curve is open to experience of the external, but it knows where true self ends and ego self begins. This is discernment that Patanjali speaks of. The clarity that Pratyahara brings makes it possible to experience and recognize the things that the dot above represents. This dot represents that infinite non-thing that spiritual aspirants seek. In Sanskrit, it's called Ishvara. In the context of yoga, it is representative of the drop of the infinite that is within each being and which is indistinguishable and inseparable from the infinite that underlies everything in the universe. Graphically, the placement of the dot is important. It lies outside the set of curves that represent the human mind. Yet the way to see it is by looking inside the mind itself. That's the curve on the right. Yoga can be accessible to anybody because we use what we've got, the mind and sometimes the body, to find the ultimate non-ego self, which is neither body nor mind. The 3 curves at the Omkar's base represent thinking and feeling self, and its identification with that aspect of self that Patanjali says is at the root of all suffering. This is a view that is also articulated in Christianity, Buddhism, and Islam. In Patanjali's yoga, it's the mind that is also the single most reliable source for finding one's true infinite self. The body and the mind can be stairways to pain or ladders to freedom, depending upon how they're used. To get to that dot, we use the 3 lower curves. We use experience. We go inside it and find the self that the dot represents. The horizontal curve that separates the dot from the 3 curves that represent experience is representative of Maya, a word that literally means veil or sheath. Maya covers things. This curve shows how living among things prevents us from seeing the deepest reality of non-thing. Maya creates an illusion that we are the things and experiences that form the content of the moving mind. This curve is like a 2-way mirror. Looking outside for self, we just see more of the external self. It's about a literal and deep identification with what we see in the mirror. When we look inside for the infinite, we find it. When we look outside for the infinite, we only see our ego self reflected back at us. So the symbol invites us to look inward. By going inside and ending identification with thoughts and things, we see what underlies them. By looking into the 3 things that the lower curves represent, we finally see the dot at the top, the real self. The potency of the graphics here is poignant in how simply it represents our failed attempts to find happiness outside in material possessions, relationships, alliances, and behaviors. When we look to those things for happiness, we only see a reflection of more things. This curve tapers where it separates the top dot, the infinite, from the previous curve on the left, non-attachment to experience. That is because once that clarity happens, we see what has been true all along. Experience and the infinite are ultimately inseparable. The A, the U, the M, and the silence are all one. While it may be helpful to understand the meaning of the character, there is likely greater value in simply making the sound while listening, following its path and then being with the silence, then doing it again. Try it and see if it works for you. And if it doesn't, then do what the ancient yogis and the best yoga teachers suggest. Try something else. Without giving myself the freedom to not chant, I would never have found my way to understanding finally what this chanting is all about.